a whisper from the past, sealed in iron, buried in ink, and powerful enough to make men kill to silence it. In the heart of London, a strange artifact surfaces, rusted, forgotten, but not harmless. What begins as a curious consultation soon unravels into a battle over memory, power, and the truths we dare not write down. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a grey morning in early September of the year 1891 that I found Mr. Sherlock Holmes in a mood of particular disquiet. The summer had passed with no more than the occasional burglary or blackmail case to rouse his interest, and the languor of inactivity was beginning to settle upon him like the fine fog which pressed against the windows of our Baker Street sitting room. He sat cross-legged upon the armchair, his dressing gown clutched loosely at the waist, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his gaze fixed upon the dying embers in the hearth. "There is a peculiar weight in the air today, Watson," he remarked, not shifting his eyes. "Either a storm is brewing, or a case is about to walk through our door. I find myself hoping for the latter. One may open a window against the weather, but ennui, that is a more persistent invader." My reply was forestalled by the sharp knock of the post, followed by Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stairs, and the soft thump of an envelope upon the carpet. Holmes retrieved it with a certain predatory grace, eyes brightening the moment they fell upon the object. The paper was thick, old, and yellowed by time. Its script was ornate and curiously faded, not the crisp black of fresh ink, but rather a reddish-brown hue that resembled, in colour, if not in texture, the trace of dried blood. Holmes examined the address closely, then held it at a shallow angle to the lamplight. An educated hand. Note the flourished capital H in Holmes, but unaccustomed to writing in haste. See how the tail of the apostrophe S curls unevenly. He inhaled faintly. "Iron gall ink. Curious. No return address. I dare say this letter has travelled a far more complex route than the postal stamp suggests." Before Holmes could break the seal, the bell rang again, and scarcely a moment later a figure appeared at the door, thin, pale, and wrapped in a long black coat that hung about him like academic robes. His eyes flickered about the room with the quickness of a hunted animal. I trust this is the residence of Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked in a whisper that trembled on the edge of audibility. Holmes gestured him in with a wordless nod. The man stepped across the threshold, then, to our mild astonishment, turned and slid the bolt on the inside of the door. "I must apologize," he said, "but I believe I am being followed." He clutched a leather satchel close to his chest and made for the farthest chair, casting glances over his shoulder as though half expecting the gaslight to shiver and reveal some ghostly assailant hiding in the walls. Once seated, our visitor withdrew from his satchel an object wrapped in a folded cloth. With great care and not a little hesitation, he unfurled the linen to reveal an antique writing quill whose metal nib had long since corroded into a brittle shade of rusted brown. "This," he said, placing it gently on the table before Holmes, "is what they want." Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest, his fingers hovering just above the artifact. He did not touch it at once. Instead, he regarded it with the same intensity I had seen him direct at bloodstains, ash samples, and murder weapons. "You'll forgive me," he said at last, "but I had not realized ink pens were presently in vogue for armed robbery." The man gave a dry, joyless chuckle. "I did not believe it myself until the first break-in, and the second, and the carriage accident that was not, I believe, an accident at all." Our visitor's name, as he at last supplied it, was Mr. Edmund Langthorne. He delivered it with the uncertain cadence of one who has not spoken aloud in days. His hands, long-fingered and ink-stained, trembled slightly as he drew forth a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles and settled them upon the bridge of his nose. "I am, or was, an archivist of some minor note at St. Ignatius College, Oxford," he said, his voice faint but cultivated. "My field is restoration and cryptological provenance, parchment, code, ink decay. I speak better Latin than I do English on most days." Holmes gave an almost imperceptible nod. "And yet here you sit, far from your beloved manuscripts, clasping a rusted implement as if it were the key to your life. You are either in grave danger, Mr. Langthorne, or gravely mad." The man gave a dry swallow. "The two, I fear, are not mutually exclusive." He cast another nervous glance toward the door and then toward the covered quill. There was something hunted in his expression, a man pressed against the edge of some knowledge too large for him to bear alone. "I've come, Mr. Holmes, not to accuse, nor to beg for safety. I've come because I do not know where else I might turn." Holmes rose slightly in his chair, the glint returning to his eye. "Then I suggest, Mr. Langthorne, you begin at the beginning, and do so quickly. It is seldom that a rusted pen has killed a man, but it seems this one intends to. My mentor, Professor Alderwick, passed away some 6 months ago, under what were deemed natural circumstances," Langthorne began, his fingers now knotted in his lap. "He was a solitary man, as so many of our trade are. His affection for the dead exceeded that for the living. But he was brilliant, meticulous, and paranoid." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Paranoia in the hands of a scholar often suggests the presence of something worth hiding." "Quite," Langthorne replied. "Upon his death, his effects were bequeathed to the college for cataloguing. However, a private parcel, small, wrapped in linen, sealed with an unfamiliar crest, was left to me directly. Inside were several weathered documents and this quill." He paused, his voice catching slightly. At first glance, they appeared unremarkable. Fragments of political correspondence, marginal notes in ciphered Latin. But Alderwick's last letter to me, enclosed with the parcel, hinted at something else, something buried beneath ink and dust. Holmes had begun to pace slowly. "And you believed it?" "I did," said Langthorne, "for within a week of receiving the parcel, my home was broken into. Twice. At first I assumed coincidence, perhaps students seeking valuables, but then a volume from my shelves vanished, and nothing else disturbed. A week later, as I crossed the road to meet a bookseller in Bayswater, a carriage mounted the pavement. I escaped with a bruised shoulder and a torn coat." "And you bring me," Holmes said, tapping the cloth-wrapped object on the table, "this quill, believing it to be the source of your misfortunes?" Langthorne hesitated. "No, Mr. Holmes. I believe it is the key." Holmes had unwrapped the cloth once more, gazing thoughtfully at the corroded quill as Langthorne continued. One of the documents in Alderwick's bundle was a page written in Latin, archaic but legible. However, several of the letters appeared inconsistent in their fading, as if written in two separate hands, or perhaps with two distinct inks. "I suspected a cipher, an elementary form," Holmes asked. "Substitution, yes, but layered. Once decoded, it referenced another document, Sigillum Regis, a manuscript long rumoured to contain a list of royalist agents from the 17th century who plotted restoration during the interregnum. Historians have dismissed its existence as apocryphal." Holmes hummed. "Historians often dismiss what they fear is true." "It was one of Alderwick's great obsessions," Langthorne went on, "and it appears he may have located at least a fragment. The quill, I believe, was not merely his tool, but part of the cipher itself. There are scratches along its edge, lines inconsistent with mere writing. It may have been used to press letters into parchment, creating indentations visible only under angled light." "And the stolen volume?" I asked. Langthorne turned to me. "A dictionary of obscure English titles, baronetcies, knights, Minor nobility. I suspect the thief was looking to cross-reference names. The attack on me occurred the day after the volume went missing. Holmes had resumed his seat and now folded his hands. And you have made no mention of this to the authorities? I scarcely trust the constables with a stolen umbrella, Mr. Holmes. Number I came to the only man in London whose name appears in more footnotes than a Bible scholar's. Holmes tilted his head, his gaze narrowing with that hawk-like clarity I had come to associate with danger. You've been in London for 11 days, he said quietly. You arrived under a false name, E. Linthorne, and are staying at the Castleborough boarding house on Argyle Street. You've spent your mornings at the reading room and your evenings 2 tables from the window at Molyneux's tea room. Langthorne stiffened. That is precisely correct. But how? Holmes lifted a hand. Your cuffs are not merely frayed but unevenly so. Your right sleeve bears the ink smudge of a quill held too long in a draughty hall. The damp mud on your boots is distinctly Clapham clay, but the outer heel carries soot from the underground platform at Piccadilly. Your spectacles, I note, are newer than your coat, purchased for concealment, not utility, and you smell faintly of bergamot and ammonia, a combination particular to Molyneux's glass-polished tables and their overzealous use of cheap cleaner. Langthorne opened his mouth, then closed it again. Holmes gave a small, satisfied smile. Your life may be at risk, Mr. Langthorne, he said, but your logic, at least, is intact. Let us now see if your late professor left behind more than cryptic ink and cautionary tales. Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece, striking a match with one fluid motion. As the flame touched his pipe, he turned to face us. Gentlemen, he said, exhaling a thread of blue smoke, this is not a case of petty theft, nor of academic rivalry gone awry. Langthorne's eyes widened. Then what? It is a matter, Holmes said slowly, of suppressed truth. The kind men kill for not out of greed, but out of fear. Whatever your professor discovered, it was no mere curiosity. It was knowledge with consequences. He stepped forward and tapped the quill lightly with his finger. And this artifact is not only a tool, it is a symbol of a line once drawn and now re-emerging. I dare say we must proceed with caution, for it seems we are not chasing a thief, but disturbing a grave others have taken great care to keep sealed. Our inquiries began the following morning with a brisk journey to Oxford, the autumn air sharp against the cheeks, and the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Professor Alderwick's estate, nestled on the fringe of the college grounds, bore the characteristic gloom of a scholar's final solitude. The curtains were drawn, the gates squeaked with disuse, and the very walls seemed to press inward with a hush. One associates only with places that have heard too much and spoken too little. We were met at the door by a housekeeper, Mrs. Adbury, who had tended the professor for nearly 2 decades. She was a thin, angular woman, her features drawn tightly around her cheekbones, as if shaped by years of discretion. Holmes allowed her to speak first, which she did only after a long, appraising look at both of us. He was frightened, sir, she said at last. Not of death, he'd stared that down in his books often enough, but of something watching him. In the last weeks he kept the shutters closed even at midday, said there were eyes in the bell tower, said they were coming down. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The Tower of St. Ignatius? She nodded. He stopped attending chapel altogether, wouldn't pass beneath it, slept in his study with a poker by the door. And he mentioned no names? Holmes pressed gently. Only that they already know, she whispered, and that some ink runs deeper than blood. Holmes turned away thoughtfully. I saw the change in his posture, the slight stilling of the breath, the narrowing of the eyes. The house had spoken, though in a whisper, and Holmes had heard what I, in my own honest way, had not. Holmes spent no more than 12 minutes examining Alderwick's study, during which time he uttered not a single word. His fingers moved over spines, drawer handles, discarded scraps of parchment. At length, he retrieved from the underside of the desk a small journal, half filled, its entries more cryptic than confessional. "What have you found?" I asked. He held up a page, its corner stained with what I at first mistook for wine. "Observe, Watson," he said. "The stain is not random. It encircles a particular line." He read aloud slowly. "The sigillum manuscript lies buried behind bells and beneath names already spoken by the unwise." I furrowed my brow. "Some esoteric reference?" "Possibly," Holmes replied. "But note the marginalia. This was added in haste. Different hand, fainter ink, no flourish. It reads, 'They watch from the bell tower.'" I shivered despite myself. There was something deeply unsettling in the notion of silent observers peering from above, like gargoyles with a purpose. Holmes closed the journal and slipped it into his coat. "We are dealing with a mind that feared more than academic ridicule, Watson. These scribbles are not the delusions of a madman. They are breadcrumbs." "Leading where?" "To a place where truth is dangerous," he said, "and where bells ring for more than worship." From Alderwick's residence, we walked under lowering skies to the Bodleian Library, an edifice I had often admired for its permanence and its silence. It was here that Alderwick had spent most of his waking hours in the months preceding his death, and Holmes believed the trail would not go cold beneath those ancient stones. He requested access to the professor's last borrowed items. The librarian, a precise little man with a monocle too large for his face, offered a slim volume catalogue and one remark. "Professor Alderwick was tireless," he said, "but solitary. He once said to me, 'Truth belongs to the dead, the living only lease it.'" Holmes perused the records, fingers dancing across titles, then paused. "Ah," he murmured, "Cromwellian suppression of the Southern peerage. That is not mere historical curiosity, it is political memory. And here, Royalist dispatches in cipher, 1651. "Do you think these relate to the sigillum manuscript?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Undoubtedly. These volumes would help him cross-reference names which, if rediscovered, could shake reputations still standing. But the manuscript itself? Not here," he said. "It is absent from the records. Either it never entered the library, or someone ensured it left unmentioned." He turned sharply. "We must speak to one more man, a scholar who has long opposed Alderwick's theories. If this manuscript is real and dangerous, then I wager, Doctor, Elias Hargrove has already attempted to erase its existence by theft or by fire." There was no humour in his voice now, only the glint of pursuit. The game, as he might have said, was well and truly afoot. Dr. Elias Hargrove received us in an office that resembled less an academic chamber than a mausoleum for ink and vellum. He was a broad man, red-cheeked and stiff-necked, with spectacles that caught the light like polished glass. His tone, upon hearing Holmes's introduction, was both courteous and clipped. "Professor Alderwick," he said, folding his hands over his desk, "was a man of impressive tenacity and limited discrimination. He believed in ghosts, you see. Ghosts of history, of conspiracy, of meaning where there is only happenstance. And yet," Holmes replied, "ghosts have been known to leave footprints, particularly when they carry steel-tipped shoes." Hargrove narrowed his eyes. "You refer to the sigillum matter?" Holmes nodded. "You've heard of it then?" "Of course. A legendary forgery, a list of supposed Stuart sympathisers, nobles, poets, clerics, said to have aided the royal cause after the regicide." "Nonsense. No more valid than alchemy or the lost gospel of Pilate." At this, Holmes drew forth the rusted quill from his coat. A small gesture, nothing theatrical, but the change in Hargrove's face was immediate. His jaw tensed, his pupils flickered. That, he said with careful slowness, is Alderwick's, I presume. Holmes smiled. Curious that you recognised it so readily. Hargrove offered no reply. As we departed, Holmes muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Guilt leaves a shadow, Watson, even upon the face of reason." It was not until we had returned to our lodgings for the night that Holmes sat in stillness, the quill in one hand and Alderwick's coded page in the other. For nearly an hour he examined both by lamplight, his gaze focused, expression unreadable. Then with sudden clarity, he held the quill aloft. "Look here," he said. "You see the faint groove on the edge of the nib? It's no natural erosion. It's been filed deliberately, flat against a surface, used not to write, but to mark." I bent closer. "You mean to impress the paper itself?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "Each letter of the cipher aligns with a faint depression on the page, traces visible only at an angle. This quill was not merely a relic. It was the key to deciphering the hidden message, a mechanical mnemonic, if you like." He set both objects down and leaned back. "Our good Mr. Langthorne did not inherit an heirloom. He inherited a weapon." As we stepped into the chill of the Oxford evening, I ventured to ask Holmes what he had truly gleaned from our visit to Dr. Hargrove. "He said too much," Holmes replied, "and yet not what mattered." "You mean his evasions?" "No," said Holmes, stopping to light a cigarette beneath a gas lamp. "I mean his silence on Alderwick's last lecture, which occurred 2 days before the professor's death. A lecture Hargrove attended." "How do you know that?" "He wore a carnation on his left lapel. The only place in Oxford to hand out such blooms on that date was the Symposium Hall at Pembroke." He exhaled slowly, and yet he never mentioned it. He smiled faintly. "When men fail to speak of what they cannot forget, Watson, it is not oversight. It is fear dressed as a mission." We returned to Baker Street with the professor's parchment secured between the pages of Holmes's copy of Hora Pauline. After a hasty supper, Holmes cleared the table of its clutter, drew the curtains, and requested that I place a low flame beneath the kettle, while he retrieved a small chemical burner from his cabinet. "What are we hoping to observe?" I asked, genuinely perplexed. Holmes, with a glint of anticipation in his eye, held the manuscript close to the growing warmth. "Mercury salts," he said, "a favoured technique of certain 17th century correspondents, especially those with secrets to bury." As the parchment absorbed the heat, I leaned in and gasped. What had once seemed like watermarks now bloomed faintly into legible Latin script. The ink was of a paler colour, almost spectral, yet the words formed clearly. "A list," I murmured. "Names." Holmes nodded. "Note the structure, each name followed by a ciphered numeral and a symbol. Titles, codes of rank and allegiance." The final name on the list drew a breath from both of us. Sir Jasper Mortlake. "That man is still alive," I said. "More than alive," Holmes replied. "He is a sitting member of the House of Lords, with considerable influence in antiquarian circles." Langthorne, who had been seated silently during the process, now spoke. This is treason, in ink. If this list is real, then the sigillum manuscript is no myth. Alderwick had it, or part of it." Holmes turned to us both. "And someone else knows it, knows that Langthorne possesses it, or thinks he does." He held the parchment aloft once more. "A hidden message, buried beneath time and chemistry, a relic of political poison that still has venom left to spill." The name of Sir Jasper Mortlake lingered in the room long after the ink had faded once more into its spectral recesses. I had encountered the man only once, years prior at a military fundraiser, and I recalled a towering presence, broad, pale-eyed, with a voice like gravel dragged across granite, a a traditionalist in the extreme and a vocal opponent of academic revisionism. "He is well respected," I remarked cautiously. "He is well protected," Holmes corrected, "which is rather more pertinent in cases such as this." Langthorne shifted in his chair. "Mortlake funded the Alderwick Archives at St. Ignatius. The new wing bears his name." "There's motive," Holmes said flatly. "If this list were to surface, especially with his own name inscribed, then Alderwick's quiet obsession would become Mortlake's public ruin." "And murder?" I asked. "Is that not a rather bold response, even for a peer of the realm?" Holmes lifted an eyebrow. "Power is bold, Watson. It moves in shadows, not squeamishly." I could not help but feel a chill at the notion. The idea that a man of wealth and position might stoop to such measures to protect an ancestral shame was a disquieting one, but no less believable for that. "I shall require a list of Mortlake's associates, aides, and known visitors in recent weeks," Holmes said. "Begin with his manservant, if he still employs the one I believe he does, Carfax. A former royal archivist, expelled for theft of records in '79. Langthorne looked stunned. "How do you—" "Langthorne," Holmes said with mild irritation, "do not mistake my silence for ignorance. The pieces are moving now, and we must stay one breath ahead if we are to survive this game." It was not until the early hours of the morning, after Langthorne had been sent to sleep in a secured guest room, that Holmes placed the quill upon a velvet cloth and began his second examination. This time, not as a relic, but as a device. "You see here, Watson," he said, pointing to the underside of the shaft. "A seam, barely visible, and certainly not part of the original smithing." I squinted. "A repair?" "A compartment," Holmes corrected. "Or rather, a mechanism." Using a fine scalpel from his chemical kit, he slid along the edge until there was a soft click, and a small section of the shaft sprung open with surprising precision. Inside lay a coil, a thin spring no longer taut, and at its center, the glint of a tiny needle. "A weapon," I breathed. "Disguised as a writing implement. Indeed, the quill was meant to do more than decode. It was designed to kill. A single touch would be enough to deliver a concentrated dose of curare or belladonna, depending on its era of use." Holmes sat back, a scholar's dagger, hidden in plain sight. I felt a sickness creep upon me. The idea that Alderwick, or worse, his enemies, had handled such a thing without knowing its full purpose was terrifying. "It was never just a cipher," Holmes mused. "This was a tool of secrecy, yes, but also of elimination, and whoever seeks to retrieve it now knows what it truly is." He snapped the shaft closed and replaced the cloth. "We are not dealing with a thief, Watson. We are dancing with someone who carries poison in both pen and pocket." Holmes insisted that Langthorne return to his temporary lodgings under escort. Inspector Gregson, whose favour we had earned in prior adventures, provided 2 plainclothes constables to watch from afar. Yet Holmes himself, in one of his frequent disguises, followed from a distance I suspect even the shadows envied. I, meanwhile, remained in Baker Street, watching the kettle boil, trying and failing to keep my nerves from jumping at every creak of the floorboards. It was near midnight when Holmes returned, his coat dusted with fog and his expression unreadable. "He was attacked," he said simply, shrugging off the disguise with practiced ease. My heart leapt. "Langthorne, was he harmed?" "No," Holmes replied. "I intervened in time. The assailant chose the narrow passage behind the lodgings, thinking it convenient for a quiet strangling. A common miscalculation." "Did you catch him?" Holmes shook his head. "He fled at the first sign of resistance, but not before leaving behind a curious calling card." He tossed a piece of wax-sealed parchment onto the table. On it, in rough Latin, was scrawled one line: "Fiat silentium." "Let there be silence. The warning is clear," Holmes said grimly. "Someone wishes this truth buried, permanently." I stared at the phrase, its simplicity more chilling than any threat of violence. For the first time since the case had begun, I felt the weight of genuine danger, heavy, patient, and very near. Holmes folded his arms. We must act swiftly, Watson, before silence finds us instead. Holmes did not sleep that night, though he discouraged my company in keeping vigil. I awoke to find him seated precisely as he had been the evening before, legs drawn beneath him in his armchair, fingers steepled, and his gaze fixed not on the parchment but on the blank wall opposite. "It is not the possession of the document that concerns our adversary, Watson," he said without preamble. "It is its destruction, or rather the destruction of what it threatens to unveil." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. "You believe the manuscript poses a real threat to someone still living?" "Not merely a threat," he said. "A resurrection. The past is no grave if it still bleeds." He tapped the decoded list. "This was never about discovery, Watson. Alderwick did not stumble upon treasure. He unearthed shame, lineage, allegiance, betrayal, threads long buried and yet still woven through modern corridors of power. And Mortlake? He is not merely protecting himself," Holmes said. "He is protecting the edifice that sustains him. Titles, wealth, reputation, all can survive scrutiny, but not proof. Proof is the one contagion aristocracy cannot inoculate against." He stood abruptly. "And so, we must give them what they fear most, not the truth itself, but the spectre of it. For men who kill to silence ink are often undone by the lies they think are safer to tell." Holmes's plan, as ever, was precise in its misdirection and surgical in execution. He began by composing a facsimile of Alderwick's encoded document, replicating the cipher's idiosyncrasies and its faint stains with remarkable fidelity. Using a weakened solution of potassium ferricyanide, he treated the page to appear chemically aged, then brushed the edges with flecks of iron oxide for verisimilitude. "You're forging a false decoding?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder with no small amazement. "A decoy," he corrected. "The real document will remain hidden. This one shall speak just enough truth to sting, yet remain vague enough to invite further pursuit." He inscribed a fabricated name into the heart of the list. A Lord Elmsby, a deceased baron whose lineage traced loosely through several living branches of minor nobility, and whose connection to Mortlake was both obscure and plausible. "Why Elmsby?" I asked. "Because he is just dead enough to be defenceless," Holmes replied, "and just important enough to provoke alarm among those who know the truth. We need only whisper that this document is to be revealed at a private gathering of the Antiquarian Society. Word will travel quickly, particularly if it passes through the right ears." "And what then?" Holmes folded the parchment carefully. "Then we wait, and when the spider comes to claim what he believes to be the web's centre, we shall be waiting in the strands." He placed the forgery inside a lacquered tube, sealed it with wax, and handed it to me. "Deliver this to Langthorne. Tell him to play the fool. No better bait than a man who appears to know less than he holds." It was not the first time I had watched Holmes sow a rumour with more delicacy than a jeweller lays a diamond. With the forged manuscript completed and the bait prepared, he turned his attention to the final and most dangerous part of the game: the lure. He began by informing a modest circle of scholars, each of them known to possess two qualities Holmes valued for this occasion: professional pride and loose lips. The pretext was elegant in its simplicity: a one-night exhibition at the London Antiquarian Society featuring a newly authenticated Stuart-era cipher manuscript and the very Quill said to have penned it. "No need to shout when whispers carry further," Holmes murmured as he sent a sealed note via private courier to a man in Mortlake's legal circle, an old friend of Dr. Hargreaves, if my memory served me right. "This is not a call to arms, Watson. It is an invitation to panic. And you expect Mortlake's agents to bite? I expect them to bite, claw, and strike if need be, he replied calmly. You see, they believe we are amateurs meddling in matters best left buried. But desperation has a scent, Watson, and ours is the perfect perfume. The exhibition was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Langthorne, under Holmes's direction, would attend and act the fool, eager, unguarded, and full of speculative half-truths. The manuscript, locked in a glass display case, would appear vulnerable but watched. The real one, of course, would remain hidden far from the venue. Holmes sent out one final letter, this time anonymous, addressed to the Mortlake estate. To those who fear old ink, it read, you may wish to see how dark it dries under proper light. He looked at me then. And now, Watson, we wait. As Thursday approached, Holmes briefed me on the finer details of the deception embedded in the manuscript. The name Lord Elmsby, he said, is a fabrication, but a clever one. He lived, to be sure, but died without issue, and was largely forgotten outside the peerage ledgers. However, he shared a great aunt with Mortlake's grandmother, a whisper of connection, but one which our adversaries cannot afford to ignore. And you believe this is enough to rattle them? Not just rattle, Holmes said. Disorient. When a lie is dressed too finely, even the liar begins to fear it may be true. In the forged decoding, Lord Elmsby's name appeared fourth on the list, accompanied by a symbol similar, but not identical, to the one beside Mortlake's own. To the untrained eye, it would appear a scholarly discrepancy. To Mortlake, it would be a warning shot masked as a mistake. Holmes knew his enemies well. They would see this not as public exposure, but as a message, one which implied there was more, possibly everything, yet to be revealed. And it was this uncertainty, this threat of a slow leak, that would provoke action. Langthorne was briefed accordingly. He was to appear mildly intoxicated, over-eager, and intellectually careless, a man who knew enough to feel important but not enough to protect what he held. Holmes arranged a seat for me close to the exhibit while he vanished into the wings under the guise of an aged librarian from Manchester. The trap, Watson, Holmes said before slipping away, is not the quill nor the document. It is fear itself, and fear, once awakened, does not sleep quietly. The hall of the Antiquarian Society that evening was alight with the rustle of egos and the clink of polished phrases. Gentlemen in waistcoats exchanged theories like currency, while the centrepiece, a glass case holding the forged quill and manuscript, drew a slow but steady stream of interested glances. Langthorne played his part, with more conviction than I had anticipated. He stammered, dropped speculative hints, and misquoted Latin with just enough confidence to appear unguardedly sincere. The crowd, for the most part, dismissed him as an enthusiastic eccentric, save for a few sharp-eyed guests who hovered near the case a fraction too long. It was shortly past 10 when I noticed a figure slip through the fringe of the gathering. Tall, cloaked, and oddly quick for the stately pace expected in such rooms. The man paused at the edge of the display, glanced once at the exhibit, and then looked upward, as though assessing the lighting. I turned to catch Holmes's eye, but he was nowhere in sight. My heart thudded. A moment later, the cloaked figure moved. It was swift and subtle, a palm pressed against the glass, a flicker of motion near the lock. There was a brief metallic click. Before I could call out, the thief's hand closed around the quill, only to find a second, firmer hand already waiting for his wrist. A soft voice, Holmes's, emerged from the air beside him. "Careful, sir. History may be written in ink, but yours shall be read in handcuffs." Gasps rose. The man jerked back, but Holmes held fast. A second figure, Lestrade in plain clothes, stepped from the far wall to assist. The hall erupted in whispers, but Holmes ignored them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, Forgive the interruption. Our exhibition now includes a live demonstration of the consequences of misjudging one's opponents. The apprehended man, now flanked by Lestrade and myself, was swiftly relieved of his hood. I confess that I started slightly upon seeing his face. It was Dr. Elias Hargrove. His composure, always brittle, had entirely vanished. Sweat beaded at his brow despite the coolness of the room, and his lips trembled beneath his grey moustache. "I was merely examining the exhibit," he said weakly. "With the lockpick in your glove," Holmes replied coolly. "You might consider refining your scholarly techniques." Hargrove faltered, then snapped. "You've no proof of anything." "This is academic tyranny." "Spoken like a man who has confused confession with rhetoric," Holmes said. "But come, perhaps we might enlighten each other. I suggest we speak plainly." Under the weight of evidence, witnesses, and Holmes's steady gaze, Hargrove's defences crumbled with astonishing speed. Within minutes, he revealed what Holmes had already suspected, that he had not acted alone. "I was approached," he muttered, "by a man representing Mortlake. He claimed the document was a forgery, that its existence was a slander upon noble bloodlines. He offered funds. I refused. Then he threatened exposure of my past." "And so you turned thief," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Fear is an effective tutor, is it not?" Hargrove nodded, defeated. "He said the manuscript could not be allowed to surface." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, exchanging a glance with me. "But as we both know, Doctor, it was never the truth they feared. It was the possibility that someone else might believe it." It was in the privacy of an adjoining room that Holmes and Lestrade pressed Hargrove for the name he had so artfully kept hidden. At first, the scholar paced, muttered vague denials, and buried himself in the folds of academic indignation. But Holmes's silence was more potent than any accusation, and the longer he said nothing, the more Hargrove's resolve frayed. At last, his shoulders sagged. "Mortlake," he whispered. "It was Sir Jasper Mortlake." There was a pause, broken only by the scratch of Holmes's pencil across his notebook. "He approached me discreetly some months ago," Hargrove continued. "He said Alderwick had been meddling in matters best forgotten, that his death, while unfortunate, had brought unnecessary attention to dangerous pages. He said that if the manuscript surfaced, it could resurrect an entire chapter of history that had been expunged for good reason." "And the good reason, in your opinion?" Holmes asked mildly. Hargrove swallowed. "Not my opinion. His. Mortlake believed the names therein would stain noble bloodlines, erode trust in institutions, and cast suspicion upon certain current political figures." "And what of the quill?" "He claimed it had once belonged to a court scribe, poisoned, possibly, a relic of the Restoration. He feared it would become symbolic, a tool to stir old fires." Holmes nodded slowly. "So, you see, Watson, it was not scandal they feared. It was reawakening. For there is nothing more dangerous to men of reputation than memory given form. And he hired you to silence that memory," I added, to which Hargrove said nothing, though his silence was confirmation enough. Holmes, being Holmes, was not yet satisfied. As Hargrove was led away, he turned to Lestrade and asked a single pointed question. "Where is Carfax?" The inspector blinked. "Mortlake's manservant. He hasn't been seen in days. Vanished before the exhibition." Holmes allowed himself a small smile. "As I suspected." Within the hour, we arrived at Mortlake's private residence in Westminster, a grand affair of red stone and thick curtains. Mortlake himself had, rather predictably, taken to his club to avoid the unpleasantness. It was the butler, Carfax, whom Holmes wished to see. We found him in the study, seated and waiting. He rose with composed dignity. "Mr. Holmes, I rather thought you'd come." Holmes offered no greeting. You were Royal Archivist until 1879. Dismissed for removing classified cipher keys. Carfax inclined his head. I prefer the term repurposed, sir. They had dust, and I had use. You knew what Alderwick had uncovered. You helped catalogue it before your dismissal, and you helped suppress it after. Carfax's gaze did not waver. Lord Mortlake believes in continuity. He feared chaos, not exposure. My task was simple: recover what could not be allowed to endure, including the quill, which you handed to Hargrove. He lacked subtlety, but he had access. And would you have used the quill? Holmes asked, voice cool. Carfax's lips twitched. If silence demanded it. I confess I shuddered. Holmes turned to Lestrade. This man, he said, has done more to rewrite history than half the historians in Europe. I suggest you treat him as such. Carfax did not protest. He only bowed, as though he had completed some private oath. One must serve something, Mr. Holmes. I served memory by ensuring it would not speak. We returned to Baker Street, well past midnight, the fog curling low over the cobbles and the taste of ink and betrayal still lingering at the back of my throat. Holmes, though weary, seemed quietly satisfied as he removed his gloves and set the forged manuscript upon the mantel. You knew it would be Hargrove, I said, slumping into the chair across from him. I suspected, Holmes replied. But he was never the only fish in the pond. We needed two nets, Watson. One for the academic who thought himself clever, and one for the servant who believed himself invisible. And both walked into them. Each drawn by different threads, Holmes said. Hargrove by fear of exposure, Carfax by a loyalty so deeply ingrained it masqueraded as honour. He lit his pipe and stared into the fire. It was never about the manuscript, he said at length. Not really. It was about control, of what is remembered and what is not. Alderwick tried to resurrect the truth. Mortlake and Carfax sought to entomb it again. And Hargrove, poor devil, simply wanted to survive the clash between the two. What will become of them? I asked. Mortlake will deny. Carfax will disappear into quiet disgrace. Hargrove, I suspect, will publish a book explaining why none of it was his fault. History, after all, is a generous editor to those who write it. I looked at the quill, still wrapped, still dangerous, and felt the cold weight of it all. Do you think the real manuscript will ever surface? Holmes gave a thin smile. Perhaps. But only if truth finds a more determined guardian than fear. He tapped the pipe twice. In the meantime, Watson, let us agree never to accept a gift wrapped in linen and silence. We returned to Baker Street in the quiet hours before dawn. The gas lights burning low, and the fire in our hearth reduced to a thin whisper of flame. Holmes, uncharacteristically weary, sank into his chair with the air of a man who had played 5 games of chess simultaneously and emerged victorious in each. I poured brandy into 2 glasses and handed one to him. Holmes, I said, unable to contain myself, you owe me an explanation, or perhaps 3. He accepted the glass, his eyes glittering faintly in the dim light. Indeed, Watson, and I shall provide it. But I warn you, the solution is far less romantic than the shadows it emerged from. I sat opposite him, notebook in hand, though he needed no prompting. He stared into the fire a moment, then spoke. This was never about relics, Watson. Not really. It was about narrative. Who holds the pen and who is erased. The quill was a tool, yes, but also a metaphor. Its iron carried more than ink. It bore the weight of power abused, rewritten and denied. He sipped slowly. Langthorne thought he was protecting knowledge. Mortlake feared he was protecting stability. And Carfax, Carfax, he believed he was preserving legacy. But all were merely actors in a tragedy whose author had been dead for 2 centuries. And you saw this all from the start? I asked. Not all, Holmes admitted, but enough to know that when history begins to speak in whispers again, men grow desperate to drown it out. Holmes leaned forward and took the rusted quill from the mantelpiece, unwrapping it gently and holding it to the firelight like a relic of both menace and meaning. You asked how I knew, he said. Let me begin with the ink. The brown, I said. You mentioned iron gall. Precisely. But more than that. The document bore traces of mercury salts, an old espionage technique used to write messages invisible until heated. Only one trained in historical chemical ciphering would think to use it, or decode it. And the rust. Holmes turned the quill slowly between his fingers. Affectation, but a calculated one. The wear patterns on the nib didn't match the strokes in the manuscript. Instead, I noted abrasions along the side, not made by writing, but by friction, as though the quill had been used to guide or score a hidden key beneath the parchment. And this tipped you. Not conclusively, but it planted the seed. When Langthorne described the break-ins and the carriage that nearly crushed him, I began to understand this was not a quest for ownership, but elimination. Someone feared what had been unearthed, and feared it enough to kill. He placed the quill on the table with exaggerated care. You see, Watson, the weapon was never just the poison inside this shaft, clever though that was. The real weapon was the document. Words, preserved through time and chemistry, that could destroy a man's carefully curated image. Mortlake feared exposure, not just of his name, but of his bloodline, his history. And Carfax, in his silence, became a curator of absence, a steward of suppression. I sat back, overwhelmed. You traced all that from rust and residue? Holmes smiled. From rust, yes, but also from motive. And nothing corrodes faster than a man's peace when his past becomes public property. Holmes opened his notebook and passed it to me. Inside, in his crisp, angular script, were a dozen names, each annotated with symbols, dates, and brief notes of aristocratic connection. These, he said, are the true contents of Alderwick's recovered cipher. The quill's rust aligned with the pressure points in the parchment. Each faint groove matched a code, a name, a station, a secret. I traced the list with my eyes, and all of them were tied, however distantly, to plots in favour of restoring the Stuart line during the Cromwellian era. Most are long dead. A few are less comfortably so. He tapped the last name, Mortlake, Jasper. Lord. There, not fabricated, not invented, real, which made our forgery all the more convincing because we understood the shape of the truth and filled it with shadow. I felt a chill, even in the warmth of Baker Street. He would have been ruined, I said softly. No, Holmes replied. He would have survived, but not unchanged. His influence, his control over narratives, both academic and political, would have been irreparably shaken. And to men like Mortlake, loss of perception is death by slower means. And so he hired Hargreaves and employed Carfax, all to suppress a list written in a language barely understood by the modern eye. Because it named him, Holmes said. Not just as an heir of a conspirator, but as a continuation of a lineage that defied Parliament, questioned authority, and betrayed a fragile order. I closed the book. A list worth killing for. He nodded. History has always been dangerous, Watson, not for what it says, but for who dares to listen. And in that moment, I understood what had truly driven the events that unfurled. The terror, not of a weapon, but of remembrance sharpened by time. Holmes rose from his chair and retrieved a small journal, Alderwick's, as we had taken from his Oxford home. He flipped to a page, turned it toward me, and pointed to a cryptic entry. Cipher known by archivists, yet spoken aloud only in silence. Carfax knew this code, Holmes said. He had helped Alderwick construct it 2 decades prior, when both served under the Royal Archives. But when I questioned him at Mortlake's estate, he feigned ignorance. I remembered the encounter. He said nothing specific, only that he served Mortlake's will. Indeed, but in the course of that conversation, he made a single error. Holmes's eyes glinted. He referred to one of the symbols in the manuscript as a royalist anchor. That phrase does not appear in any published cipher catalogues. It was Alderwick's private term for a specific marking used in Stuart propaganda and known only to those who handled his notes directly. You knew then? I asked. I suspected. It was enough. The next step was watching how far he would go to avoid discussing the cipher's construction. And that, Watson, was telling in itself. Those who truly know nothing often speculate. Carfax avoided even that. Holmes opened another slip of paper containing Carfax's own annotated note recovered from Mortlake's desk, a torn margin with corrections written in the same hand as a cipher key found in Alderwick's study. The handwriting was the final nail, Holmes said. Identical. Carfax didn't just recognise the cipher, he co-authored it, which means he wasn't merely covering Mortlake's sins. He was burying his own. And had he not slipped, we might still be chasing shadows. Holmes sank back into his chair. In the end, Watson, truth is less often revealed by what men say than by what they dare not. Holmes stood and crossed to the sideboard, where he poured himself a second measure of brandy. He took a long sip before speaking again, as though choosing carefully where to begin. Not for lack of knowledge, but out of a desire to do the thing justice. It is curious, he said, how predictable men become when pressed by memory. Carfax thought secrecy was a shield. Hargreaves thought denial was sufficient. Mortlake thought money could plug a leak. But I relied on none of their instincts, Watson. I relied on their panic. He paced slowly. The forged manuscript was crafted not simply to deceive. It was tailored. The name of Elmsby was selected for its ambiguity. The ink was aged to suggest careless preservation. The cipher was flawed in precisely the way an amateur historian might mangle it. And the exhibition? It was staged in a place so public, so academic, that those who live in shadows would see it as a direct assault. He stopped, turning toward me. They walked straight into it, each believing they were acting independently, but each step they took was one I had already set in stone. You predicted even Carfax's emergence. I counted on it, he said. Mortlake may have been the hand, Hargrove the instrument, but Carfax was the conscience of it all. And a conscience under strain will always surface, eventually. He returned to his chair. Alderwick tried to bring the truth into the light, and in doing so, he exposed a network of silent guardians who would kill for the preservation of narrative. I merely turned their methods against them. And if they had not acted, Holmes gave a faint smile, then I would have known we were dealing not with desperate men, but with professionals. And Watson, professionals never panic quite so beautifully. Holmes regarded the fire for a long moment, the flames reflecting in his eyes like half-formed memories. He lifted the rusted quill one final time and turned it in the light. It is a fitting object, isn't it? He mused. A pen that could kill, and yet what it wrote has outlived every man who ever held it. I chuckled. Rather poetic for you, Holmes. Hardly, he said. Merely practical. History, like poison, is most potent in small doses. He stood and returned the quill to the sealed box on the mantel. I've arranged for the artifact, minus its more lethal appendages, to be donated anonymously to the British Museum. Let it gather dust beside the helmets and arrowheads. There, it will do what history often does. Sit silently, waiting for someone with the patience to listen. And the manuscript? I asked. Safe, he replied, and untranslated. Sometimes it is the threat of truth, rather than truth itself, that holds the greatest sway. He tapped the side of his pipe. Mortlake will no doubt retreat behind his estates. Carfax will find quiet employment cataloguing someone else's secrets. And Hargrove, he added with a slight smile, will likely publish a scathing critique of cryptographic forgery, never once mentioning his own role in nearly becoming a footnote. I leaned back, absorbing it all. You've dismantled their story without ever writing your own. Exactly, said Holmes. It's far more elegant that way. After all, Watson, historians with pensions are the only men more dangerous than criminals with secrets. And with that, he fell silent, content to let the fire crackle and the shadows settle. While outside, the world continued spinning, quietly unaware that history had for a moment tried to speak and been answered. Some days after the affair had concluded, I found myself staring at Holmes from across the hearth, the silence between us thick with thought. He was lighting his pipe, the curl of smoke rising like a question unanswered. Though the matter of the quill had been laid to rest, my mind lingered not on poisons or parchment, but on something altogether less tangible. I still cannot quite believe, I said at last, how far men will go to conceal the past. Holmes exhaled slowly. You mistake them, Watson. They do not conceal the past, they curate it. I pondered his words. Then you believe history is not a record, but a selection? A selection, a suppression, a scaffolding of the present, he replied. The truth, as men speak of it, is far too combustible for polite society, and far too inconvenient for those with pensions to protect. I could not suppress a smile. So, our mystery was not about murder or manuscripts, but memory. Holmes gave a faint nod. Precisely. The greatest crimes are seldom committed with a weapon, Watson. They are committed with silence. I made a note of that, knowing it would end the tale nicely. And yet I was struck by the peculiarity of it all, that what had begun with a nervous man and a rusted pen had become a study in how fragile the scaffolding of legacy can be when nudged by truth. And that, more than any cipher or code, was the real mystery. The rusted quill, stripped of its poisoned needle and cleaned of the last trace of ink, now resides in a climate-controlled case in the British Museum. It is catalogued plainly. Unusual 17th century iron writing instrument. Origin unknown. There is no mention of Sir Jasper Mortlake. No reference to Alderwick's manuscript. No whisper of the blood it nearly spilled. I have visited it once since the case concluded. The label beside it says nothing of the quiet panic it caused across drawing rooms and archive halls. Children pass it by, pausing longer at the suits of armour or the mummies. Scholars glance at it briefly and move on, and yet it sits there still, silent, unimposing, and utterly unchanged. A tool once used to write words that threaten to unmake reputations now writes nothing at all. Its ink long gone, its sting disarmed. Holmes remarked as we left the museum that day that some pens are never meant to write, Watson, only to remind. It struck me then that this was Holmes's justice, not a trial, nor a headline, just a relic on a shelf, too dull to notice, too dangerous to forget. That evening, as the gas lamps flickered across Baker Street, and Holmes leafed absently through a monograph on Venetian poisons, I raised a toast to him. To your mind, I said, and to a pen that nearly rewrote history. He did not look up. I rather think it nearly erased it. You solved it brilliantly, I continued. Every layer, every lie, every ghost beneath the ink. Holmes glanced over the top of the page. And yet you're the one who shall be remembered for writing it all down. I chuckled. There is no shame in being your scribe, Holmes. He returned his attention to the page. There is some risk, however, in trusting that ink shall preserve what truly happened. I sat back. You mean even my accounts may one day be altered? My dear Watson, Holmes said, setting down the book with a faint smile. Never trust anything written in ink. Ink blots. It fades. It betrays its keeper as often as it serves him. And what then should I trust? He tapped his temple. Memory, perhaps. Or failing that, an old friend with a good conscience and an awful penmanship. We laughed quietly and let the silence settle in again. And somewhere behind glass and dust, a quill slept, empty of ink, but full of history. The mystery of the rusted quill. Complete Sherlock Holmes, script finished. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the flickering fire casting long shadows across his face. He turned the empty quill over in his fingers one last time and said, almost to himself, You see, Watson, the most dangerous lies are not shouted in rage. They are whispered in archives, etched in official records, and sealed in respectable silence. I frowned. So it was never about a single name or a single murder. No, he replied. It was about who controls the memory of things, and who is willing to kill to keep a story untold. What do you think was the criminal's greatest error in the mystery of the rusted quill? Forging the past, or underestimating the man who remembers everything? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy solving mysteries from the golden age of deduction, don't forget to subscribe and share this story with fellow lovers of Sherlock Holmes. Until the next case, keep your wits sharp and your ink dry.